Drodzy Państwo,
Dziękuję.
będziemy przygotowywali się do kolejnego już dzisiaj panelu. Z prezentacją wystąpi trójka osób z ORCID and the Future of Research Information. Nasi goście to panowie Matthew Bice, Josh Brown i pani dr Laurel Haak. Już za kilka chwil zaprosimy ich tutaj na scenę. Prezentacja będzie prowadzona w języku angielskim, natomiast w tej części z pytaniami oczywiście będzie można zadawać pytania po polsku, my je będziemy tłumaczyli, także będzie wszystko tutaj przygotowane. Jesteśmy już praktycznie gotowi. Naszych gości widziałem w korytarzu, więc za kilka chwil pewnie powinni się tutaj pojawić. Hi, hello. You can come to the stage. The floor is yours. You have 50 minutes, you know. Yeah.
Thank you.
So should I?
Do you want to start with an introduction?
It's very bright up here. It's hard to see you. Thank you very much for inviting us to come and present. We're very, very excited at ORCID to be part of your conversations about your next generation of higher education evaluation. My name is Laurel Haak. I am the executive director of ORCID. I'm going to be in the question and answer session, so I'll be sitting here on the couch. Next to me is Josh Brown, our director of partnerships. And this is Matt Bays, who is our regional director for Europe, Middle East, and Africa. They will be giving the presentation. And we hope to have some time at the end of this presentation to take your questions. So hold those questions, and I very much look forward to having a conversation with you. So please.
Yeah, great. And apologies again that this presentation isn't in Polish. As Josh said, he's got please and thank you. But we do welcome any questions. At the end, we do have a translator, so if there's questions, if you'd like to ask them in Polish, we're happy to take those, and the translator can help us out with those. This presentation is really split up into three sections. I don't know if you want to sit, Josh. I don't know. Sure. You might get tired. Three sections. The first section, I really want to just talk a bit about what ORCID is and how we fit into the community. And then Josh will go into a bit about ORCID from a national infrastructure and how ORCID is involved in that point of view. And then to end, we'll talk a bit about ORCID from a national point of view and national case studies, so use cases of 3 regions that we've selected. So this is the ORCID vision, and without going into the vision or repeating the vision, what you can see on the screen, imagine this world where we could run a query in a system and get all the activities associated with that individual. So a single query, understanding what that individual, every single professional activity. So imagine that world. Imagine a world where we could run an evaluation or a grant application or a manuscript submission, and that individual can pre-populate those forms in that instance by clicking a button. And imagine a world where we can uniquely identify individuals, their professional activities, and their affiliation and their funding near real time. And this is the world that ORCID is creating and establishing in different communities. And essentially, we're here today to invite the community in Poland to join us on this and help us build the community here. Names are not enough, and this is where ORCID really started. It's very common that we have shared names, common names, different versions of names, and they can be spelled differently. And how do we identify or distinguish from each other? So linking professional activities by names can be a challenge. I use an example, and this is something that we picked up on Twitter, and it's, I guess, an extreme example. I'm not saying every single article is like this, but essentially we have the challenge where there can be multiple names in a particular article. And this, as I say, is an extreme case. I'm not saying every article is like this. But the challenge is, even if we limit it down and we search for just one variation, so Wang C on this article, we would still get 5 variations of this name, which creates a challenge. So if we're searching by names, it's really difficult to associate professional activities with that, and this is where identifiers come in. We also recognize as a community as a whole that individuals have multiple profiles and multiple identifiers, and ORCID to this extent don't exist to, I guess, replace this, but be the infrastructure behind this to connect all of these systems together, but also alleviate the burden on the individual, so the individual doesn't have to worry about all of these different profiles and different identifiers out there. I'm going to hand over to Josh, who will continue from here.
Thanks, Matt. I think the key thing to think about also on this slide is that all of these examples were taken from the email signature of a single researcher. So this person is maintaining an online identity in all of these different places. So ORCID stands for the Open Researcher and Contributor Identifier. And we are a collaboration, a global collaboration from across the research information community. Every aspect of scholarship has fed into our planning and our design. And you can look at us in several different ways. We are an identifier for researchers. So where you have the researcher's name, which is attached to their articles, you have a unique identifier. Now, the name might be shared with other people, but the identifier will be unique to that person. The name might be expressed in different ways, but the identifier is always the same. So it enables you to find everything that's connected to that individual. We're a registry. At its simplest, it's a database with a list of those identifiers and the information that's connected to them, so you can access that online or via our API. And speaking of the API, it's this set of standard procedures. We use commonly used web standards. So for the developers in the audience, it's very simple to interact with our systems using established standards and techniques. But crucially, and this is what we're going to be talking about, I think, a lot today, is we're talking about this committed community. We are a membership organization. We are made up of the organizations, the people who work with our systems, who use our systems, and who are actually making it valuable. And in that context, as we said, we are a global membership organization, and this is about changing the way research information flows all around the world. We're open. We are a not-for-profit organization. We are platform neutral. We can work with any other system. We integrate with other researcher identifiers and profile systems. The registry is free for individuals to use, so any researcher who wants to go and register for an ID can do that now. It takes 30 seconds. As we said, we're owned by our members. We are completely independent. All our data is open. Our software is open source. We have an open API and open documentation. This means that you have the confidence and the security of being able to see exactly how everything works and how we operate very, very clearly. We're very transparent. One of the things that's absolutely crucial to the way we operate is that the researcher is always in control of their own data. We do not own the data in the ORCID registry. Researchers own the information that is connected to their identifier. They can connect their ID to different research systems, whether that's a publisher manuscript submission system or the repository or research management system at their university. They decide who can access that information, and they can take that access away if they choose to in the future, and they choose decide what information they will make public. Now, once information is made public, it is free for anybody to use, reuse, analyze, and integrate into their systems. So our mantra for research interoperability is enter once, reuse often. And the key thing here is researchers should not be typing this data in again and again. They should just be putting it in once, and it should be flowing from one machine to another so that the information is reused. Now, to give an example of how this works in practice, many researchers will be familiar with ORCID from publisher interactions. So they go to submit an article to a journal, they are asked for their ORCID ID, and the publisher can then push information about that article to their ORCID record. At the moment, there's a lot of work with institutions, so employers working with us to push employment information to the ORCID record. This means that if a publisher wants to see where someone works, they don't even have to ask them, they can just look at the ORCID record and see that. Our next big area of activity is going to be funding systems, so moving information across between funding systems. So all of these arrows go both ways. So funders receive information, and they can push information about grants and awards back to the ORCID record. From the ORCID record, it can flow to publishers or employer systems. At the moment, we have 712 members from 41 countries all around the world, including a lot of consortia. Most of our consortia are actually in Europe, as you can see from that list. More than 3.7 million researchers have chosen to register for an ORCID ID, and there's a huge amount of data connected to those. I mean, 20 million works, for example, which could be an article, it could be a data set or something different. And there are 550 different integrations in platforms and software systems and services all around the world. As an example of where the community is really working with us to try and drive adoption and drive some value through via ORCID, we have the Publishers Open Letter, which is where a group of publishers committed to using ORCIDs very effectively, so they collect them when an article is submitted, they make the ID available in the metadata in the article itself, and now 1,500 journals around the world are actually requiring ORCID IDs from the corresponding author, out of more than 7,000 who are actively collecting IDs at manuscript submission. Now, publications are just one part of the research information ecosystem, and as you may have seen from the slides already, we are embedded in the whole research information lifecycle. We work with partners across the world and across all the sectors of research, from research institutions to funders to publishers to repository systems. The key thing is, it's a very uneven, complicated landscape. Research information is hard. Some systems are stuck in the past. Some systems aren't even online. There are organizations who manage their entire research portfolio using a spreadsheet, or worse, paper. This is a problem because it means that this information can't be reused. It doesn't flow. It can't go from one system to another. And it means that researchers and administrators are copying this information manually in many cases, typing the same basic information again and again and again and again and again. And just think for a second about not just the time it takes to collect and verify this information, but if you think about a skilled researcher or an experienced research administrator, there's a lot of expertise being used to do these very simple, repetitive tasks. That's not a good investment. That's a huge waste of skills and talent as well as time. So we believe, and this is a vision for the future we share with a lot of research standards bodies, agencies around the world, is that things can be made better. Research information can be digitized, it can go online, where it can be shared openly. You should use open systems wherever possible, enabling the reuse and enabling the maximum efficiency for the use of that information. Automate whatever possible so that researchers don't even have the chance to start typing in that information. It just flows. It's there before they've had a chance to see it. And by doing that, you let the machines do the talking. So they talk to one another and they push that information around. What that means is, if you use the identifiers for people's, places, and things that are available, then all of a sudden, that's a signpost for those machines. That's a clue that there's some more information, and it tells them what kind of information is there and where they can go to get it. And the researcher doesn't have to do anything. I think the key thing to remember is, as I mentioned, we've got these identifiers for people's, places, and things. There are a lot of useful identifiers. So just looking at this slide, there are digital object identifiers. I'm sure many of you are familiar with DOIs for articles or data sets. But here there are different IDs for organizations, funding organizations, organizations who've received funding, different IDs for people that work in different ways with different systems. Linking all of these together is incredibly powerful, because if you have one signpost, it tells you where you might want to go. If you have 3 or 4 signposts, there's a whole journey mapped out for you. And we'll give you some examples of how these actually work together in real life. But the crucial thing is, if you want to get the best out of identifiers, if they already exist, you should be using them already. If you're not using them, then you can start. The systems are here, the systems have been built, and they're available. Help us as a provider community to understand where you have gaps, where you need IDs, where you need us to interact with your systems, so that we can learn from that and we can make our systems work better. And take advantage of some of the connections that we've already built. There are already a lot of ways that we can save researchers a huge amount of time. We can provide better information for research administrators, evaluators, organizations up and down the system. So I'm going to give just 2 examples of how researchers are benefiting from identifiers from work that we've already done that involve interactions between more than one identifier system. This is something we're very proud of. We call it the auto-update process. But at its simplest, I'll use the example of submitting an article to a journal, but it also works for data sets and other things. When someone submits their article, they provide their ORCID ID. At the next step, when that is accepted and it's published, the publisher includes the ID in the article and in the metadata, the descriptive information about that article. When they send that information to Crossref to create a DOI for that article, Crossref see that ORCID ID and they can push that information to the author's ORCID record because they know who that person is, because they have the ID. From there, it can flow to any other system. It could go to the repository at that researcher's home institution. It could go to a funder system. The point is, once it's there, it is openly available and it's connected to every system that connects to the ORCID registry. This is an example of how this looks in action. This is actually an article I wrote last year, and I got an email from the publisher at 1 o'clock on a Monday afternoon saying my article was published. 5 minutes later, I got this email saying, would you like to add it to your ORCID record? So I clicked the button that says Add Now. I signed in to my ORCID account. So this was the slowest bit because I had to remember my password. I clicked Sign In, and it was done. That's authorized. Since then, more information has flowed into my ORCID record without me having to do anything. So there is, you can see information there. In the middle, you can see that article. That was automatically put into my record. And in the red boxes, you can see the source. So you can see that this came from the organization that created that DOI. They created that digital object identifier. And I haven't had to type any of that. That's been provided by the publisher, and then the identifier system has pushed that to my ORCID record. Anybody who wants to look at that can pull that from my ORCID record and reuse that data, knowing that it is trustworthy and it's accurate. And here's a researcher who actually saw this happen. They signed in, they did it, and bang, it was in their ORCID record incredibly quickly, without them having to do anything. What's nice is now I get regular updates just telling me that this information has been provided and it's been done, and I haven't had to do anything. Here's another example of identifiers working together. You can see here 2 employment records for somebody from the University of Warsaw, where you've got the bottom one you can see. Matt is the source for that because he added that manually to his ORCID record. The one above was pushed using our API. It was pushed from a machine to our system. And that shows the university as the source of the data. Now, you know that if the university are claiming this person works for them, you can be pretty confident that that person actually does work for the university. You can add end dates, so you can see here there are times when the researchers started working there and when they left. There's their job title. And this information, crucially, behind the scenes, because it's come through our API, has an identifier for that organization. So if you need to find out more about the organization, you can do that. That's available for reuse. It's open information that anyone can use. So this is all about how not just information flowing into and from the ORCID record, it's about creating new information and new connections that are then available for everyone to reuse. The time savings, the benefits for this just continue to grow. As more and more people, as more of those 3.7 million researchers and those 700 plus members are pushing this information through the ORCID registry, these interactions become faster, more frequent, and more valuable. And that's really what we're trying to do, is drive this adoption and drive the flow of data. So we're going to talk a little bit about identifiers in a national context and give some examples of where people have actually explored the use of ORCID IDs. So I'll pass back to Matt.
Great, thanks. It's a bit like musical chairs, this, changing seats. As Josh mentioned, we have 17 regional or national consortiums globally. So what we wanted to do here is just simply select 3 examples, 3 regions, and talk about how they implemented ORCID on a national context and use those examples. So the first we're starting with Italy. So Cinica created a national consortium for ORCID in Italy. This comprised of 70 universities and 4 research centers, and this has continued to grow over time. This was a collaboration also with ANVA, so the National Research Evaluation Agency in Italy, and the Conference of Italian University Rectors. And then they launched the project RIDE, which was the Italian Research Identifier. And they were looking to use ORCID in a common platform across all the institutions. By the end of 2016, more than 80% of Italian researchers, including PhD students and postdocs, had registered and linked their ORCID ID with articles or records, research outputs dating back to 2006, also associating their ID with historic works. We saw really interesting growth. There was this national approach and this common platform that was set up, and we had a number of institutions implementing over the space of about 9 weeks. And what's really interesting to see here is that in the space of 9 weeks, that 60,000 researchers pretty much enabled or either registered for their ORCID ID or connected it to the system, the national system. And this obviously left a position for the country to have a robust system for research evaluation. Interestingly, we also saw, so there was a national database and the ORCID Hub, which was where they connected their IDs. So individuals had the opportunity to go into the ORCID Hub and create or connect their existing ORCID ID, and 98% of researchers in Italy did this. They also had the opportunity to go to the national database, which was an archive of their works, and link that to their ORCID ID, so to enable their ORCID ID to be automatically updated from the national database, and 94% of researchers did this. This was a fantastic example of a region that took a consolidated approach of providing a common platform across the country, and researchers really adopting it because it works. And all of what Josh was talking about a moment ago is when these things automatically link and we see these trusted sources, it's really simple and clear to the individual the benefit, and clear to the administrators. We then move on to the UK. So the UK took a slightly different approach, no common platform, but took a coordinated approach around ORCID. And this came out of I guess, several years of community engagement and discussions, and ARMA, and JISC funded 8 projects for ORCID implementation. And the aim of these projects were to understand, well, what is the cost-benefit analysis of integrating with ORCID? And this link here will take you to that information, and it's quite interesting to see that there's a significant cost-benefit analysis to integrating with ORCID through streamlining efficiencies and providing trusted, connected data. Really does benefit from a cost-benefit point of view. JISC has a consortium. They have 84 universities and 7 research councils that are part of that consortium. And they're also seeing funders starting to accelerate the adoption of ORCID. So NIHR, Wellcome Trust, include ORCID IDs in their grant submission systems. Again, if I go back to my first slide where I spoke about imagine this world where we could pre-populate fields, these are the types of systems and these are the types of funders, how they streamlining these application processes. Healthcare also exploring how to use ORCID IDs from a national research evaluation point of view. And we also heard a bit about the changes, the Draft Act yesterday, and these are things that we encourage you to think about in the region here. Then Germany. So Germany had a coordinated policy and researcher engagement stance, I guess. There was an initial project funded in 2016. So in October 2016, there was a project that was launched for 3 years, funded by the German Research Foundation. This allowed for coordinated implementation of ORCID across institutions, so sharing best practices across institutions, how to integrate ORCID into various systems, and how to grow the adoption amongst individuals. And they focused really on organization and technical issues within the consortium. They also have the BASE, or the Bielefeld Academic Search Engine, and this is an engine that's available in the ORCID registry and allows individuals to go and select works that they had previously published and pull them into their ORCID record and have that automatically pushed in. The consortium, or the project in Germany, also did a comprehensive legal review, and really a lot of what they focused on was around the ORCID Trust program. So privacy and data protection is extremely important to ORCID, and we have a very comprehensive trust program. This trust program revolves around 4 key pillars. The first being individual control. As Josh mentioned, the individual's in complete control which systems connect to their ID and have the permission to either push or pull information from that ORCID ID. They also have granular control on visibility of the metadata within their record. So per item, per article, per email address, you as an individual can go and change the privacy settings. We also work on maintaining a reliable registry that's robust and secure. We also are accountable to the community to protect that data in our registry, and also make sure that it's accessible through common standards, and also information integrity. So a lot of what we're doing at ORCID is building a trusted infrastructure. So the more systems that connect to ORCID, the more trust we have in the utility. As Josh showed us with the different sources, the more trusted sources we have asserting information into ORCID, the better, the more trust and credibility we have within the registry. To date, or this was just last week, in Germany there are 102,000 individuals that have registered for ORCID IDs, and there are 25 institutions that are community members that are part of ORCID, and there's a number of different project partners there. So looking at the value of a national approach, and this is what we would like to encourage Poland as a region to come together and discuss with ORCID how they could possibly consider this. There's obviously some intricacies and different things that we need to talk through, but really taking a coordinated national approach allows for all sectors, all individuals within that community to have fairly distributed access to the benefits of the research that's being produced. They have a better understanding of the impact and challenges of research in context, and it builds efficiencies and convenience gains for researchers and administrators alike. And really what we're trying to achieve here is also ensure that the individual has more time to spend on research and less time on administrative tasks. And often we talk about, research trends globally, is on one aspect we're building frameworks to measure and track research performance and evaluation, but on the other hand we're also trying to reduce administrative burden on the individual. And these goals sometimes seem cross-purpose essentially, and this is where ORCID, if you take a coordinated national approach, you can really optimize these efficiencies and then allow for individuals to spend more time on their research and in turn produce better quality research. The things to think about from looking into a national approach would be to define what you want to get from your approach. So to contextualize this in the sense with, if we look at just yesterday with the new draft act, what do you want out of the approach, and what is most urgent in your context from a national perspective. Think at the level across sectors, as I mentioned. Think across the whole network. So this is not just universities, it's not just funders, it's not just national systems, it's across sectors, including publishers, anyone in your community that is involved in research and scholarly communication broadly. And then also look internationally at international best practice. We used a few examples here without going into too much detail, but really ORCID builds a community of collaboration, and we try to get different communities, different institutions together to share common ideas about how we can use ORCID and the registry to, I guess, achieve or solve the problems that we have in the different regions. I'm going to leave Josh. I said I'll leave him the last slide to end off with the final.
Thank you. So yeah, I think what we have here is we're at a change. We're at a point where everything is shifting. And we look at what you're doing here in Poland, and we are very, very excited because it's a very conscious approach. It's analytical, it's deliberate, and you as a community have a chance to jump past problems that have plagued other countries who have tried to modernize their research ecosystems. Making more information available electronically, using more of these identifier systems, the bridges, the connections they have gives you as a nation, as a research community, as a component in a global research community, the opportunity not just to be better, but to be a leader. And this opportunity is hugely exciting, and we are very, very excited to be here today to find out more about your plans and to share ways that we can work together to help make this vision a reality. So thank you very much for inviting us. We'd be very happy to answer any questions you might have, but most of all, be excited about what's coming next, because I think it has the potential to be brilliant.
Yes, thank you. So.
I think that was, we can leave that now.
So this is the time I get to talk, which is really just to listen. So I think that there might be a microphone out there, I'm hoping. So if you have questions about ORCID, about how to register, about who we are, what we do, how we build community, please, this is your opportunity. There's a question right there in the middle, and there's one down here.
Hi, hello. Thank you very much for your presentation. I'm working with data on researchers' individuals, so ORCID is a big step forward, big leap forward. But my question will be about the future of ORCID. So how do you see integrating more than publications? We've already seen employment as an example, but we have a lot of more information that we will probably need to submit to evaluation efforts as well. So also listing research interests, teaching activities, outreach, not only blogs which are online, but also workshops that I, for example, conduct and stuff like this. So in the long term, how do you see about integrating that data, and how much of it has actually needs to be provided by researchers themselves because it's not online?
Right, and that's, I think, the really big question is there's a lot of information you just talked about that is not online. And we are a community organization. If that's something that researchers would like to see represented in the ORCID record, then work with us to figure out how to do it. I want to make it very clear that ORCID is definitely about more than just publications. We've done a lot of work with the data community to enable connections to data sets. So as Josh was talking about the connections and auto updates with publications, we have a similar interaction with DataCite for updates for data objects. That could include a presentation, a workshop, a report from a project. So there's many things like that. We are also have the possibility, as we mentioned, of bringing affiliation information into an ORCID record. So most people think of that as employment, but that also means education. How can we connect somebody's PhD thesis and completion certificate essentially to the ORCID record? There are certifications that researchers go through. For example, I'm certified to use animals in this context. So there are other ways and other types of affiliation that we can store. I served on a panel. I was the chair of this group. I'm a member of this society. So all of those things are possible now. When we talk about teaching, we need to understand how and where that should fit, where the data come from that would help to populate the ORCID record. And I think one thing that's really, really important to understand about what we do is that we are a connector of information. We are not a CRIS. Okay, so for information that is connected to an ORCID ID, there must be some local database that holds the thing that ORCID is connecting to, and there should be an identifier associated with that thing. So when we talk about courses or teaching, I could imagine connecting to a syllabus, for example, but where does that information sit? And so that's where we need to work with the community to figure out how that works. But it's definitely possible. Yep. There's a question.
Peer review is also another example
true.
of
Yes.
something that works in ORCID already, and you can have peer review asserted by the publisher or funder directly to your ORCID record. So you can then, in terms of evaluation and performance, say, I did so many peer review activities in this period.
Right. There's a question here.
Zbigniew Błocki, Director of National Science Center, a Polish grant agency, so a funder. So we've been recently thinking about ORCID, especially last few days, because I saw that ministry in some documents that were sent to us seems to want to somehow integrate Polish system into ORCID. So my question is, what would be potentially a benefit for us to be a member versus just a user?
Right.
And as I've checked online, there are quite a few research councils that are members, but I haven't seen the biggest ones among them, say, NSF, NIH.
NIH is a
ERG.
member.
NIH is a member.
They don't let us use
sorry.
their government agencies tend to not like to have others reuse their logos. But NIH is a member.
I see.
Department of Energy in the
Okay.
U.S. is also a member.
Right. So I was wondering, whether you can just be
Sure.
a user, not necessarily a member, but maybe it would be good to be a member. Okay.
Right, and so I'm going to start to answer this, and then I'm going to turn it over to Josh, who as Director of Partnerships is helping to launch a project very specifically with research funders around the world to help demonstrate the value to funders of being a member, right? But also to understand from you what you need us to do. So the value, and a funder can right now with our public API collect identifiers from the researchers coming to submit grant applications. You don't need to be a member to do that. However, many funders are very interested that their funding is acknowledged in the papers and the data sets and the other outputs and products that researchers create during the funding. And to do that well, it's very, very helpful if the funder uses the member API to take information about the award and put it into the ORCID record. Laurel Haak got funding from the National Science Foundation. Here is the ID for the grant, and here's the ID for the foundation. That is now in my ORCID record, and I can then share that with the publisher when I go to submit my paper. So it becomes very easy and convenient for a researcher to include funding information in their paper. And that comes back to the funder because now you have embedded in a paper the actual grant identifier and the name of your organization spelled the way you want to with the organization ID that you want. And from a reporting perspective, you now have very clear evidence that this paper was funded by your grant. And it's very easy to query a database and say, show me all of the papers that have this funder ID in it. So that's what we're trying to do is say, yeah, I mean, you could continue to ask the researcher to type all of this stuff in, but you know, I don't know if you've ever seen what an NIH grant ID looks like. It's this long. And it's hard to know where to start or end with that identifier. And people spell NIH about one of 300 different ways. So when you're trying to find all the papers associated with your funding organization, it's very, very hard to do. And many times, the researchers don't acknowledge the funding. So we're trying to make this more convenient. Yes?
Particular projects have identifiers as well,
Okay,
or
so-
just the grant agency?
Right, and I think the answer is I would hope so, right? I mean, I'm hoping that your systems store the identifiers for the projects, right? And so one of the projects we're working on now, this one that Josh is working on, is does it make sense for funders to start thinking about using a persistent identifier for your funded projects? Whether that is something you create or use somebody like DataCite or Crossref to mint a DOI for those projects, right? And the other part of this is, as I was mentioning to the gentleman over there, is there also then needs to be a public database that you put out with a basic description of your grants. Here's the abstract, here's the title, here's the ID. That's something that we can link to, that you can link to as we're doing all of this work. So there's a lot of things. Josh, I've been talking over you. Do you want to mention a little bit about the FIG or anything else? Make an invitation?
Yes, we're currently launching a major program of activity for 2018. It's a project called ORCID Reducing Burden and Increasing Transparency. And what this will do is initially we're going to focus with a group of funders who will be our pilot partners, and we're in active conversations with some very big funders around the world for this. They're going to concentrate on what information they need to collect from a researcher when that researcher applies for funding. Now, if we can identify sources, find identifiers, and automate the exchange of that data, you can save a huge amount of time for researchers, and you can save time for the administrators at the funder in checking that information, verifying that information. That's step one. Once you have that information, you can start pushing things like, so if someone reviews grant applications for you, you can push that information into the ORCID record, so the next funder who deals with that person can say, this person has reviewed grants for this funder I respect. Therefore, this person must have a certain status in their community. And then that funder can continue to push that information. So it's encouraging the sharing. Downstream from that, when you have this volume of data flowing between systems that are connected with IDs, reporting can be automated, reporting can be made much simpler, so that where you have difficult things, maybe some things are offline, maybe they're physical samples that don't have a database yet, that's the only thing the researcher has to type in. It saves them a huge amount of time, it speeds up the process, and it helps you to understand the impact as it's starting to take place. So this is the vision of this project. The second part is, as Laurie mentioned, it's the funder infrastructure group. And it's looking at, where, as Laurie mentioned, this idea of if you want to have identifiers for grants, you need to make that information available somehow. So how can we have a piece of infrastructure, a shared database, where funders can put this information and have identifiers for grants that can be reused by people? It helps in all sorts of ways, whether it's for reporting, whether it's for open access policies, for tracking connections between researchers and across their careers. There's a whole load of ways this could be really, really valuable information. So how can we, as a community, both in terms of infrastructure providers like ORCID or the other ones we've mentioned today, and funders, come together to create the platforms, create the systems that link all of this together? So there's two parts to the project. One is automating this flow of information, and the other is closing gaps so that we can have even more information flowing in the future.
And so if you're interested in this, meet us right after. We're basically taking expressions of interest in participating in the FIG. So, yeah.
I'm Jarosław Bydłosz, Akademia Górniczo-Hutnicza w Krakowie, or AGH University of Science and Technology in Krakow. Just please explain me, you mentioned a couple of identifiers of system like researcher ID, some Scopus item, and so on. What you are going to be? You are going to be one of many, one of a few, or you are going to, connect them in some way? And the second section is more technical. Second question: how is your identifier built? You've got some numbers, for example. You've got like area code, like 48 for Poland or plus 48 and so on. If I see a number, can I read directly something from the number or area of origin of scientist or something different?
Okay, I'll start with the second part. The identifier is completely opaque. It's a 16-digit string of numbers. It looks very much like a credit card. That's what it is. You cannot tell when somebody registered. You cannot tell where somebody registered. You cannot tell any other information about a person other than here's a 16-digit alphanumeric string. That's it. That's intentional. Now the first question, how do we play with the other person identifiers? We collaborate with ISNI, we collaborate with Scopus Author ID, we collaborate with Researcher ID. So the idea is these other identifier systems have different models for how they interact between the person and their work. In many cases, they are, well, for 3 of those cases, they are assigned after and are not known to the researcher. What ORCID does is it says, look, if you want to have an identifier for a person, the person should know they have this identifier and be able to make choices about when to use it, how to use it, with whom to use it, and how to connect it to other pieces of information. So at ORCID, we put the researcher squarely in the front in an ownership position with that identifier. So I have an ORCID ID. I have connected it to my Scopus Author ID. I have connected it to my Researcher ID. I have connected it to my ISNI identifier. That means that now inside of Scopus, all of the works that have my Scopus Author ID are also now connected to my ORCID ID. And you can search Scopus using my ORCID ID. Same thing in Web of Science through Researcher ID. Same thing in the ISNI database. So that's what we're trying to do, is provide a bridge identifier between these others, but also put that ID firmly and squarely in the hands and ownership of the individual. I hope that answered your question.
Can I just add one thing to that,
Yes.
please, Laurie? Yeah, there's one other detail there that makes us, I think, different is the fact that we don't just work with all these other identifier systems. We have these open APIs, so people can embed ORCID ID collection and creation in their existing systems. Now, some of the IDs you mentioned are proprietary, and they're great within that company's products or that company's systems, but they don't work across. So if you go to a different company, maybe that ID won't work as effectively. Whereas the thing about ORCID is we work in all of these systems, so wherever you want to use us, you can, without having to rely on one product or system.
And this is what's also important about us being open. We can build the bridge halfway, and it is built halfway. It's for other systems to come and connect their system to us, and any system out there can essentially connect to ORCID.
So is there another question up here?
Thank you. Couldn't find a better spot to ask the questions, so for that. Maciej Koniewski from Jagiellonian University. Trying to summarize the discussion from yesterday, it seems that in upcoming evaluation system, after the reform in Poland, two ways are on the table right now. One is to measure the impact of the works that we do. And the second is to look where we publish, and this is kind of proxy of the real impact that the works of the researcher really is. And for now, what I hear here, the ORCID is in the second area. And my question is how the ORCID, if it's possible, can address the situation that some paper is published on the personal website, or it's online, but it's not in any database, official one. I mean, this situation happens, and that could be a working paper, which some researchers intentionally didn't publish somewhere, and already is getting very highly cited and has a big impact. What in this situation?
Right. So there are a number of self-publishing platforms and repositories. And so ORCID has been integrated into a few of these. I don't know if I should start naming names here, but when I have a working paper, for example, from an ORCID working group, I will post the paper on one of these kind of self-publishing repositories, which assigns a DOI. And once that DOI is assigned through either Crossref or DataCite, in this case DataCite, that paper becomes an object that is more easily shareable and can come back into, not the paper, but the information about it, can come back into my ORCID record and be shareable. So if Poland is using ORCID as a proxy for the works of an individual researcher, it is entirely possible to get working papers, blog posts, other things like that into ORCID if we leverage some of these other identifier systems. So I wouldn't feel like it should be locked out, and that's certainly something that we could work with you on to help understand what systems are used primarily here and how we can work with those platforms to enable integration of ORCID so these things can flow more easily.
And once it's in ORCID, a lot of the benchmarking and analytics platforms work off ORCID to do that evaluation.
Yeah, so we don't do the metrics on the stuff in ORCID. We're really seen as this connection platform that others build services on top of to do things like research impact and metrics. So there was another follow-up question down here. I think we have 37 seconds left on the stage here. Anybody else?
Okay. May I?
Yes, go ahead.
Yes. I noticed that all these identifiers, indexes, indexing, and so on, it's developing very quickly, and unless you make some things to simplify it, in several years, we need a special degree to understand it fully or to comprehend it, yes? So maybe in a few years, something happens that will make it simpler, because apart from my branch of knowledge, some of us, or most of us, need to be people who are very, working on indexing, researching, connecting, registering, on looking, putting something into databases, or looking into bases or something like that. So please of making something simpler or simplifying it.
Yes. So
not at the moment, but maybe in future,
yes.
Close future.
Right.
Thank
so
you.
ultimately what we're trying to do is make it more convenient to be able to share information. But you can't start off the first day and have this all work. That's the nature of networked systems. So we are gradually, as we work with the community, these systems are gradually built up and connected, and the experience for the researcher and the experience for the administrator is getting better every day. We understand it needs to continue to get better, and so we really value your feedback on how we can do that and how we can work with you also to do that. So thank you very much for your comment. So
And I think that's
I guess
time
with
up,
that,
isn't it? So thank you very much, everyone, for your attention.
Yes, thank you for your attention.
Okay.
And we're going to be around for a little while, so if you have more questions.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for your
you.
inspiring.